Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're tackling something, something I know you're super curious about: international exchange rates,
Hmm.
and not just how they work, but how we could restructure these systems to really boost global economic development.
Yeah.
We're diving deep into a 2019 academic paper by Maurice Höfgen from Maastricht University
Okay.
titled "How Could an International Exchange Rate Regime That Fosters Economic Development on a Global Scale Be Designed?"
It's a pretty dense title,
Right.
but it gets right to the point.
No messing around. What's really cool is that Höfgen takes a modern monetary theory, or MMT, approach.
Right.
So we're not just going to critique the current system, we're going to explore a completely different way of thinking about exchange rates.
Yeah, it's a perspective that challenges a lot of conventional wisdom.
Exactly. Prepare to have your assumptions challenged.
All right.
First things first, let's acknowledge that the current system, this mishmash of fixed and floating exchange rates, is... well, it's not exactly working wonders for global economic development, is it?
Not really. It's more like a non-system, as Höfgen calls it, creating a lot of volatility and uncertainty.
Okay, so for those who might be thinking, wait, back up. What's the difference between fixed and floating rates?
Right.
Can you give us a quick refresher?
Of course. In a fixed exchange rate regime, a country pegs its currency to another currency, like the US dollar,
Okay.
or a commodity like gold. The goal is stability.
Right.
By eliminating exchange rate fluctuations, you theoretically encourage international trade and investment.
Got it. So no surprises, everything's nice and predictable.
Exactly.
What about floating regimes?
Yeah.
That's where the market takes over, right?
Right. Floating exchange rates are determined by the forces of supply and demand in the foreign exchange market.
Okay.
The idea is that this allows for more flexibility,
Right.
as the rate can automatically adjust to changes in economic conditions.
Sounds good in theory, but both systems have some serious flaws, don't they?
They do. Both are vulnerable to speculation and often result in what are called misaligned exchange rates.
Okay.
That means a currency's value doesn't accurately reflect the underlying economic fundamentals of a country, which can have some pretty nasty consequences.
And misaligned like those shoes that look amazing but kill your feet after 5 minutes.
Kind of. Except in this case, it's entire economies that feel the pain.
Ouch.
Höfgen uses the examples of Brazil and Greece to illustrate these flaws.
Ah, yes, the poster children of exchange rate woes.
Exactly.
Let's start with Brazil. They have a floating rate, and their currency, the real, has been on a wild ride against the US dollar.
Yeah.
Even though economic theory would predict smoother movements, right?
Right. It's like trying to build a house on shifting sand.
Oh, I don't like that.
Figures 1 and 2 in the paper really bring this to life.
Okay.
They show just how unpredictable and volatile floating rates can be.
Which, as you can imagine, creates a nightmare for businesses trying to plan for the future. Now, what about Greece?
Yeah.
They're locked into the Eurozone's fixed rate system, and that hasn't exactly been a fairy tale.
No, it hasn't. The Eurozone is a prime example of how fixed regimes can sacrifice a nation's control over its own monetary policy, something we call monetary sovereignty.
Okay, so monetary sovereignty, that means a country's ability to make its own decisions about things like interest rates and money supply, right?
Yes,
Basically, the freedom to tailor its policies to its unique economic needs.
exactly. And without that freedom, it's like trying to steer a ship with a broken rudder.
Oh.
Greece lost that ability when it joined the euro, and it's had very limited options for dealing with its economic challenges ever since.
So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
They are.
Meanwhile, Germany, within that same Eurozone, has actually benefited from the system.
Right,
Its strong export sector thrives under a relatively undervalued euro.
right. But it's a zero-sum game.
Right.
One country's gain is often another country's loss.
So we've got Brazil battling volatility with its floating rate, and Greece stuck in a fixed rate system that's robbed it of its monetary sovereignty. That's a pretty bleak picture, to be honest.
It is. Which is why Höfgen goes beyond simply critiquing the existing system. He lays out 4 essential criteria
Okay.
for what a development-boosting exchange rate regime would actually need to achieve.
Let's hear them. What does a good system look like according to this paper?
First, it needs to deliver stable and predictable real exchange rates.
Okay.
That means taking into account inflation differences between countries so that currencies actually reflect true competitiveness.
So no more of those crazy swings or artificial advantages
Exactly.
that we see in the current system.
The second criteria,
Okay.
a good system, must promote fair and efficient international trade.
Okay.
Exchange rates shouldn't create artificial barriers or distortions that give one country an unfair advantage over another.
A level playing field, essentially. Okay, what's the third criteria?
The third, and this is particularly important given what happened to Greece, is monetary sovereignty.
Right.
Each nation must retain control over its own monetary policy.
Right, they need the tools to respond effectively to their own unique economic circumstances, not be dictated to by a one-size-fits-all system.
Exactly. And finally, the fourth criteria is that the system must foster financial stability, minimizing that harmful speculation
Right.
we see driving so much volatility and misalignment in the current system.
So let me get this straight. We need stability, fairness, sovereignty,
Yes.
and we need to put a stop to that casino-like speculation that's messing everything up.
Yes.
Did I miss anything?
Nope, you got it.
Yeah.
Those are the four pillars of a better way forward.
Okay.
And with those principles in mind, Höfgen proposes a radically different approach,
Okay.
a system he calls rule-based managed float.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff.
Yes.
Rule-based managed float. It sounds intriguing, but how would it actually work?
It's a fascinating concept. Instead of being purely fixed or purely floating, this system relies on cooperation between central banks to manage exchange rates within a set of agreed-upon rules.
So it's managed, but in a cooperative way, not just one country trying to manipulate things to its advantage.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
Central banks would work together, intervening symmetrically in the market to ensure that target exchange rates are maintained.
Okay, I'm following so far, but this is where I get a little lost.
Yeah.
How would they actually determine what those target exchange rates should be?
Right.
What's the rule in this rule-based system?
The core principle is purchasing power parity, which Höfgen calls the PPP path.
PPP path, okay.
In simple terms, the nominal exchange rate, the rate you see quoted on the market, would be adjusted regularly to account for differences in inflation rates between countries.
So if one country has higher inflation than another, its currency would be adjusted downward to prevent it from becoming artificially overvalued.
Exactly.
Kind of like a built-in rebalancing mechanism.
Exactly. And Höfgen specifically favors using the Producer Price Index, or PPI, as the measure of inflation in this context.
Now, why the PPI? We hear a lot more about the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, when people talk about inflation.
That's true. But remember, we're talking about international trade here.
Right.
The PPI is a better reflection of the costs faced by businesses involved in international trade.
Mm-hmm.
It measures changes in the prices of goods and services produced domestically rather than those consumed domestically.
Okay, that makes sense. Think of a country that produces a lot of raw materials like oil or copper.
Exactly.
The PPI would capture those price fluctuations, which directly impact their export competitiveness.
Exactly. That's a more accurate measure for managing exchange rates in an international context.
All right, so we've got our rule, this PPP path based on the PPI. But there's still one big question that pops into my mind.
Mm-hmm.
How do you determine the initial exchange rate when this whole system kicks off?
Right.
That seems like a tricky starting point.
It is. It's not just about current prices. It's also about ensuring fairness from the get-go, so no country starts with an unfair advantage.
So how does Höfgen propose to solve that initial exchange rate puzzle?
Mm-hmm.
Do we just throw darts at a board?
He recommends a more structured approach. Initial exchange rates would be negotiated based on unit labor costs,
Okay.
with a global institution playing a moderating role to ensure things are balanced.
Interesting. So it's not a simple formula. It's a process of negotiation and compromise guided by objective measures.
Exactly. And there's even more to this MMT-inspired approach.
Okay.
Höfgen recommends 2 additional features
Okay.
that really challenge conventional thinking.
Ooh, I love challenging conventional thinking. Hit me with them. What else does the system have up its sleeve?
First, he suggests a permanent zero interest rate policy, although he acknowledges this wouldn't be mandatory for all participating countries.
Wait, zero interest rates?
Yes.
That sounds pretty radical.
Yeah.
Most central banks are obsessed with manipulating interest rates to manage their economies.
They are?
Why would he recommend this?
It ties into MMT's view of how interest rates actually function in a sovereign currency system.
Okay.
They argue that the natural rate of interest is actually zero, and that fiddling with interest rates isn't an effective way to manage an economy.
So instead of relying on interest rates, the focus would shift to other tools like fiscal policy, government spending, and taxation to steer the economy.
Precisely. And it's a very different way of thinking about macroeconomic management
Right.
than what we're used to.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together.
hmm
So, zero interest rates are on the table, at least as a suggestion. What's the second additional feature?
The second feature is what Höfgen calls one country, one currency.
Okay.
Each nation would have its own unique fiat currency.
So, no more shared currencies like the euro. Everyone goes back to their own national currency.
That's the ideal scenario, according to this model.
Okay.
He argues it's crucial for both monetary sovereignty and exchange rate stability.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the logic here. With each country having its own currency, they can tailor their monetary policy to their specific needs, and the exchange rate mechanism can focus on ensuring those currencies are fairly valued relative to each other. It's all about creating a system that actually facilitates global trade and development, not one that hinders it.
You got it. It's a whole new way of thinking about exchange rates, one that moves away from that zero-sum mentality and towards a more cooperative approach.
All right, so far so good. It all sounds pretty amazing, but I'm sure it's not all smooth sailing.
You're right, no system is perfect.
All right.
Höfgen acknowledges that there are definitely some challenges and potential obstacles to consider.
Well, let's not shy away from them.
All right.
Bring on the tough questions.
Right, challenge accepted.
So we've got this intriguing new system with a catchy name, rule-based managed float. But we all know the devil is in the details. Höfgen doesn't just lay out the principles, he actually models how this thing would compare to the status quo, right?
He does. He uses two simplified models to illustrate the potential benefits of his international regime.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What do these models show?
The first model compares the international regime to a fixed exchange rate regime, and it really highlights the constraint of foreign reserves in those fixed systems.
Okay, remind me again how that works. A country's ability to spend in a fixed regime is limited by the amount of foreign currency it holds, right? Because it needs those reserves to maintain that fixed exchange rate.
You got it. It's like having a spending limit on your credit card.
Right.
You can only spend as much as you have in reserve. And that can be a real problem, especially if a country needs to stimulate its economy during a downturn.
Right. It's like a straitjacket on government spending. Does Höfgen's model show how that plays out?
It does. Figure 5 in the paper is a great visual representation of this. It shows that by removing this foreign reserve limitation, the international regime would actually allow nations to spend what's needed to reach full employment and their potential GDP.
That's a game changer. It's about reclaiming that monetary sovereignty to truly serve the needs of the people.
Exactly. And that brings us to the second model, which compares the international regime to a floating exchange rate system. And this one is particularly interesting because it focuses on how that inherent volatility in floating rates creates so much uncertainty that it actually discourages investment.
Yes, those wild swings in the Brazilian real we talked about earlier. It's hard to make long-term commitments when you don't know what your costs or revenues will look like in the future because the exchange rate could shift dramatically.
Precisely. And figure 6 in the paper illustrates this beautifully. It shows that the international regime, by stabilizing exchange rates, could lead to higher investment and GDP, even compared to a floating system with the same level of volatility.
Wait, hold on a second. Even if the ups and downs were the same in both systems, the international regime would still lead to better economic outcomes. That's counterintuitive.
It is. But here's why. It's not just about the magnitude of those changes. It's about the predictability. The international regime creates an environment of stability and transparency. So even though the exchange rate might adjust over time, businesses can plan for those adjustments.
So it's not like trying to build a house on shifting sand anymore. You actually have a solid foundation, so to speak.
Exactly. That reduced uncertainty unlocks investment potential that simply wouldn't be there in a floating system. And that translates into more economic growth for everyone.
It's a win-win. So Höfgen's models make a pretty compelling case for this new system, but let's be real. I'm sure he acknowledges that it's not all sunshine and roses, right? There have to be some challenges and potential obstacles.
Oh, absolutely. No system is perfect, and Höfgen dives into some of the key issues that would need to be addressed.
All right, let's get into it. What are some of the big challenges he identifies?
One issue he raises is the persistence of trade imbalances. While the international regime would definitely reduce those artificially created imbalances, differences stemming from things like natural resource availability and demand would still exist.
Right, some countries are naturally going to be better at producing certain goods or services, so we'd still see some trade surpluses and deficits regardless of the exchange rate system.
Exactly. And this raises an important question. how could this proposed system help those countries that might be facing balance of payments difficulties? Think about countries that are dependent on essential imports like food or energy, but lack a strong export base.
It's one thing to talk about theoretical models, but we have to consider how this would play out in the real world, especially for the most vulnerable countries.
Absolutely. And Höfgen acknowledges this. He sees a role for international assistance to address these situations. He envisions the global institution that oversees this new system, also providing support to those countries struggling with trade imbalances.
So it's not just about setting rules for exchange rates, it's about creating a system of cooperation and support. A rising tide lifts all boats, so to speak.
I like that. It really captures the spirit of this system. It's about global solidarity, not just stability.
Okay, so that's trade imbalances and the need for international assistance. What else is on Höfgen's list of potential challenges?
He spent some time discussing the practicalities of transitioning to monetary sovereignty. Specifically, how a nation that's been part of a shared currency system like Germany in the Eurozone could actually reintroduce its own currency.
It's easy enough to say every country should have its own currency, but how do you unwind from these deeply integrated systems? That seems pretty complicated.
It is. But Höfgen lays out a step-by-step approach, drawing on the principles of MMT and something called chartalism.
Okay, now you're throwing around some fancy terms.
Yeah.
For those of us who aren't economics professors, can you break that down a bit?
Of course. Chartalism is basically the idea that a government's power to tax creates demand for its currency. It's like a magic trick. The government essentially brings its currency into existence by requiring people to pay taxes in it.
Ah, so it's not about pegging your currency to gold or some other external factor. It's about the government's power to tax. That's a mind-blowing concept.
Right. It shifts your whole perspective on how money works. So in Höfgen's scenario, the first step for a country like Germany would be to redenominate all of its tax liabilities in this new currency.
Meaning they'd start requiring people to pay their taxes in the new Deutschmark or whatever they decide to call it. And that would create demand for the currency because people need it to pay those taxes.
Exactly. And once that's done, the government would start spending in the new currency because people need a way to earn the currency to pay their taxes.
So the government is both creating the demand and the supply. I'm starting to see how the pieces fit together.
Right. And to complete the transition, all new debt instruments issued by the government would also be denominated in the new currency. So it's a coordinated process of shifting all government transactions, taxes spending, borrowing into this new Deutschmark.
And then, poof, they've got their own currency again. But I imagine this wouldn't happen overnight, right?
No. Höfgen recommends a gradual approach to minimize disruptions. They could even redenominate existing accounts and financial assets at a fixed rate to smooth the transition.
Interesting. So it's not about flipping a switch, but carefully managing the process of phasing out the old and phasing in the new.
Precisely. It's definitely complex, but it's certainly possible with careful planning and clear communication.
Okay, we've covered trade imbalances, international assistance, and transitioning to monetary sovereignty. What else is on Höfgen's list of potential challenges?
He also addresses the potential impact of those symmetric foreign exchange interventions that we talked about earlier. Remember, in this system, central banks would constantly be buying and selling currencies to maintain those target exchange rates.
Right, like those gardeners tending their delicate ecosystem. But wouldn't those interventions mess with a country's money supply?
They would. When a central bank buys foreign currency by selling its own, it expands its monetary base. And conversely, when it sells foreign currency and buys its own fiat, it contracts its monetary base.
So wouldn't those interventions potentially cause problems with interest rates or even create inflation?
That's what a lot of people would assume. But Höfgen argues that those fears are largely unfounded, especially within this MMT framework. Remember, he's already advocating for a zero interest rate policy. So those interventions wouldn't be used to manipulate interest rates in the first place.
Okay, that takes care of the interest rate question. But what about inflation? Wouldn't injecting more money into the system lead to higher prices?
That's the conventional wisdom. But MMT challenges that assumption. It argues that inflation is primarily driven by real resource constraints, not simply by the amount of money in circulation.
Meaning, if there's spare capacity in the economy, unemployed workers, idle factories, then increasing the money supply wouldn't necessarily lead to inflation. It would just put those resources back to work.
Right.
It's like if you have extra ingredients in your pantry, you can bake more cookies without driving up the price of flour.
Exactly. And Höfgen even cites research showing that programs like quantitative easing, which involved massive injections of money into the system, haven't actually led to runaway inflation.
Fascinating. So this system could potentially expand the monetary base without triggering those inflationary fears that seem to dominate so much of our economic policy discussions.
Exactly. It's about understanding how money actually works in a sovereign currency system and using that understanding to create a system that truly serves the real economy.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the economic challenges, but I have a feeling those might be dwarfed by the political obstacles. This is a pretty radical departure from how the world works right now.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Shifting from a competitive zero-sum approach to a cooperative one is a massive undertaking. It would require a fundamental rethinking of how we view exchange rates and their role in the global economy.
So let's talk about the politics. Whose interests would be served by this new system and whose might be threatened? Where are the potential flashpoints?
Well, let's start with the potential losers. It's pretty clear that countries that have benefited from manipulating the current system to their advantage, like Germany with its undervalued euro, would likely resist this kind of change.
Right. They've built their entire economic strategies around maintaining those competitive advantages. And it's not just countries, right? Certain industries would also be unhappy.
Absolutely. Export-oriented industries that thrive on a weak currency would push back.
Yeah.
And then there's the financial sector, which profits handsomely from all that volatility and speculation we see in the current system.
They'd see this as a threat to their bottom line. So we've got powerful countries, industries, and financial interests potentially lined up against this new system. Who's on the other side? Who would be in favor?
Well, think about the countries that have been harmed by the current system. Those struggling with overvalued currencies, limited monetary sovereignty, and that constant threat of financial instability. Countries like Greece or those in the developing world that are often at the mercy of those global financial forces.
So it's an alliance of the victims, those who stand to gain the most from a more equitable and stable approach.
Precisely. And it's not just about national interests either. Within those countries, think about the working class, which often bears the brunt of exchange rate misalignments and the austerity policies they necessitate. They would likely benefit from a system that prioritizes full employment and domestic economic well-being.
So it's potential battle brewing between those who benefit from the status quo with all of its imbalances and volatility, and those who are pushing for a more cooperative and stable approach.
That's the crux of it. And ultimately, the feasibility of this new system depends on whether those pushing for change can build a powerful enough coalition to overcome the resistance from those who profit from the status quo.
It sounds like a David versus Goliath situation.
It does, but remember, David won that fight. And Höfgen even suggests that the best way to build momentum for this kind of change might be to start small. Maybe a group of countries could implement the system on a regional basis as a kind of proof of concept.
Show the world that a better way is possible. Plant seeds and let them grow. I love it. Okay, so we've covered the shortcomings of the current system, Höfgen's intriguing alternative, and some of the economic and political hurdles that would need to be overcome. Where do we go from here?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that the current exchange rate system, this patchwork of fixed and floating regimes, is simply not doing enough to promote global economic development. It's creating winners and losers, fueling instability, and ultimately holding back our potential.
It's a system designed for a different era, one that no longer serves the needs of a globalized economy.
Exactly. And Höfgen's paper offers a powerful challenge to that outdated system. He argues that a cooperative rule-based approach, grounded in the principles of MMT, could create a much more stable, equitable, and ultimately prosperous world.
It's a bold vision for sure, and one that really gets you thinking about the possibilities. But even Höfgen admits that there are still some unanswered questions.
Yeah, he does.
Like what?
One of the big ones he highlights is the role of global institutions in this new system.
Okay.
Who would moderate and oversee such a complex arrangement?
Right.
And how would disputes between countries be resolved? These are pretty critical details.
Yeah, it's one thing to design a system on paper, but it's another to actually create the institutional framework to make it work in practice.
Right.
We've seen how dysfunctional global institutions can be. So how do we make sure this doesn't just become another bureaucratic nightmare?
It's a valid concern. You need clear rules, transparent processes, and a strong commitment from participating countries to make it work. It's a tall order for sure, but the potential benefits might just outweigh the challenges.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one big question you want our listeners to walk away pondering? What's that thought-provoking nugget to leave them chewing on?
For me, it comes down to this. Given all the potential benefits and challenges we've explored today, is such a system actually politically feasible? What forces might stand in the way of its implementation, and what might drive its adoption? It's really a question of power interests and ultimately the kind of global economic system we want to create for the 21st century.
It's a question worth pondering for sure. You've given us a lot to think about. Big thanks to you, our expert guide, for navigating these complex waters. It's been a wild ride.
My pleasure. Always happy to dive into these fascinating topics.
And to you, our listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and often mind-boggling world of international exchange rate regimes. We hope you learned something new and maybe even came away with a little bit of hope that a better system is possible.